Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Kapner Research Council webinar series. Today is our second webinar of the spring semester, and we have a guest speaker from the National Science Foundation as our speaker today. Dr. Nilesh Salvi, a member of the Kapner Research Council, will make the formal introduction of our speaker, but before he does so, I would like to say a few words about the Kapner Research Council, or CRC. We formalized CRC about 4 years ago as an advisory council that would provide advice to my office, that is the Kapner Office of Research. We do have faculty from every division represented on the council. We also have staff, graduate students, and postdoc representation. This webinar is an example of some of the activities of the council, in addition to providing advice to my office. They also organize the annual Kapner Research Symposium, help make decisions regarding several research-related awards in Kapner, and funding opportunities from my office, like the Joy of Discovery Seed Grant Program. When they help make important decisions in the Office of Research, they are representing you. In other words, CRC plays an important role in shared governance in our college. Before I hand over to Nilesh, let me remind everyone that we will have a Q&A session in the end, but you need to post your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat room. Nilesh will be moderating the Q&A session in the end. So without further ado, Nilesh, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Banaya Schrag, a renowned program director for Small Business Innovation Research, or SBIR program at the National Science Foundation, and a respected policy liaison between SBIR and Small Business Administration. Throughout his career, Dr. Schrag has demonstrated his passion for helping small businesses grow and succeed through the SBIR program. And his work has been recognized and applauded by his peers and colleagues alike. Dr. Schrag holds a doctorate in physics from Brown University, which has undoubtedly contributed to his illustrious career in technology development. He has served as the principal investigator for several federally funded projects. It is an honor to have been here with us today, and I'm sure that his insights and experiences will be invaluable to us all. Ben?
Thanks, Nilesh. I don't know. That's a hard act to follow. I appreciate that kind introduction. I appreciate the opportunity from Mengshi and Dr. Jose and everybody for setting this up. Thanks you all for attending. I know everyone's really busy, and I appreciate you all taking the time. So let me put my slides up and I'll dive in, and I guess we'll take questions at the end, but I'm looking forward to having a little bit of a dialogue once we get done with the prepared remarks here. Okay. Nilesh, give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides. Yes, thumbs up? Okay, great. So thanks everybody, thanks again. I'm gonna focus here really on the part of the National Science Foundation that I think is kind of the place that I spend my days, which is a lot of names for it, but we think about it as lab to market. Technology transfer is another way people think about it, but I work in the part of the National Science Foundation that really is involved with trying to get new technology out of the lab and into the world to have a broader impact on the country and on the world. And so I'm going to talk about some of the big programs that we fund that try to do this in different ways. Most of the NSF is doing basic research funding. I'm happy to answer questions about that. I was an entrepreneur myself. I'm happy to talk about that if that's interesting to folks. But I suspect for most folks, the programs I'm talking about will be maybe of the most interest. So I'm happy to take us in any direction, and just let me know what's most helpful for everybody here today. So the program that I spend most of my time in is called the, as Nilesh mentioned, it's called the Small Business Innovation Research Program, or SBIR. We also call this America's Seed Funds, and that's obviously a kind of a doing business as trade name. And again, the name is carefully chosen because the goal of our program is really to provide early stage support for disruptive technology inside of small businesses. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that. And then I'll talk about a couple other programs that are kind of complementary sister programs toward the end here. I think all of these will be fairly relevant to this audience because a large percentage of the folks who participate in these programs do have connections to academic institutions and researchers. And I suspect many of the folks here today are affiliated with the university. So before I dive in too much here, I want to kind of point out I've got maybe I don't want to go too long here. I've got maybe 10 or 12 slides, and I'm not going to talk at all about the process, the machinery for the program. I don't want to get into the details of the weeds there. My goal is really to try to hit the pieces of our program for people who are not familiar at all with it, and specifically the pieces that might be unexpected or unusual to you, in case you weren't expecting what we do here, so that you have a good understanding about really what we're looking for and what the goal of the program is. Stepping back, I will say a couple things before I dive in here. I do work for the National Science Foundation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It is about a $9 billion program budget. And most of what the NSF does is, almost all of what we do is funding decisions, right? So we basically take that $9 billion and about 93% of that funding goes back out the door to researchers mostly, people doing science and engineering. And most of what the NSF does is basic research, which is research basically with the goal of understanding the world without necessarily having any more practical understanding or practical goals of the research. It's pure knowledge discovery and dissemination, most of the time at colleges and universities. So we are a certain piece of that $9 billion budget that has a slightly different goal, which is really to help folks take the next step. Once a discovery is made, to try to help people understand what that discovery means for the world, and if it's appropriate, to help folks directly take that and create it, bring it into a form where it can actually directly impact the taxpayer, the customer, the citizen, and make the world better in some way. So our program, the small business programs, are this year they'll be closer to about $250 million budget, and our goal is really to really help folks translate these what we call deep technology innovations into commercial impact. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by deep technology soon. That is one of the key things to understand about our program. Our program is centralized in the sense that we have a very tight-knit team of program directors. All the program directors in the small business programs are here to do one thing well. We're all hired directly to basically try to work with small businesses in this program to help them be successful. And so we are able to be hired with kind of typically a dual experience that we bring to bear to this program. And the two things that we really try to hire people for, that I have and my colleagues have, are number one, we have a relevant technical experience in the fields that we look at, whether that be physics or chemical engineering or biology or microelectronics. We all have advanced technical degrees, typically PhDs. And we also all have what we think about as commercial experience, but in most cases that actually means startup experience. So almost all of us have either been a startup founder, such as I was, or a startup investor, or have otherwise been in institutions where our job was to basically make technology work and take it to the market. That's the goal. So there are 12 of us, and this is what we get up in the morning hoping to focus on for our professional day. And so we are specialists in this particular thing. Our program is a non-dilutive funding, which is to say we give typically grants or cooperative agreements, which is what most researchers are probably familiar with, because we want them to be flexible. And as I'll talk about, it's really important that our funding is very flexible, because typically we're funding early stage companies where there's a lot of risk and a lot of uncertainty and things change quickly. We have funding in phases. Typically, our first phase of funding is about $250,000, and then our second phase is $1 million, and we often provide funding beyond that, where most companies that really do well within our program end up receiving something like $2 million over maybe 4 to 5 years of support from NSF. And so that $250 million that were funded this year is spread across about 900 companies at any given time that we are actively funding. And those companies are across the entire United States and territories and across basically any technical or technology area where there is disruptive technology, a technology frontier that discoveries are being made at. And there's also some sense of practical impacts of the innovations that are being discovered. We are a program focused on startups. Now, this is really important because this is very unusual in the government. Most government agencies tend to fund companies that are more established. They have more of a track record. They're less uncertain. They're a little safer. They feel safer to the government. They're known quantities. In contrast, at NSF, we're really trying to be the first capital into these businesses in most cases. We feel like that stage of a business's development is where we can have the most impact. And we feel like when we're trying to fund this risky technology, the companies that are brand new have the most risk, the most technical risk that fits our mandate the most. So our goal is really to help people figure out if their technology is ever going to be able to be reduced to a product or service at all, to figure out if there's some fundamental reason why it's never going to be able to be something a customer might buy, because the laws of nature don't allow it to be reduced to practice in that way in some cases. So most of the companies we fund are the average company we fund is only a handful of employees. I think 2 employees is the most common number. Most of these companies are brand new to government funding. So if you've never done this before and you're not sure about the government and you're a little bit intimidated, our program tries to be very friendly and open to new applicants. That's almost the majority of what we fund is people who are just sending in their first ever NSF proposal to us. And most of the companies that we fund are pretty much brand new. Typically in the 2 years old is about the average age of these companies. And so this is something where we are dealing with the kind of organization that is a little different from what you see in a lot of other government agencies. Obviously, this kind of brand new startup company, for example, is just about is about the most different kind of organization from, say, a university than you can imagine. And so being within NSF and funding something that's very different from a university makes it so our program is a little different than a lot of the other colleagues that we have inside the foundation. Our goal is really to provide that early funding to these brand new companies when the technology is so unproven and so risky that maybe nobody else is willing to take the risk. But then the outcome that we're looking for is that those companies will use our funding. Our funding is for research and development, and they're going to use that funding to prove their technology, develop it, start to develop a prototype, maybe start to scale and optimize it. And eventually, by the time our funding is running out, that they are going to raise follow-on financing or maybe start actually bringing in product revenues. And that is really required because the kinds of technologies that I talked about, the risky, disruptive technologies, take a lot of money and a lot of time to get fully to market. And our $2 million is not going to be nearly enough in almost any case. And so this is a selection of headlines of companies in our portfolio over the last year and funding that they've raised following on our support. You probably see that Benson Hill, which is kind of in the middle of this, that's actually a Missouri company that went public for about $2 billion. Very cool, very interesting company that we supported when they were getting going. And so the goal here is to have these companies take our funding and really take off to the moon and raise private funding, grow, create a lot of jobs, create big impacts in the market. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for home runs of different kinds of companies. The other thing I want to point out here that you may notice from these headlines is that we fund an extremely broad range of technologies. You can see there we've got cybersecurity, we've got robotics, we've got agriculture, we've got energy, we've got semiconductors, we've got materials science, and everything, AI, space. Our program has no limitation basically on the technology area. We're technology agnostic. We need technology, we require it, but we don't tell you which technology is better than another technology. And so if your company is in any field, you still have a place for applying to our program, which I think again is unique. There's no other funding agency that I think will fund as broadly as we do. And one of the reasons I know that is because my company, my startup before I came to NSF, got early funding from this program, and the only agency that was willing to fund us was the NSF, and that was because we were developing a semiconductor diagnostic, and no other agency is interested in semiconductor technology. Nowadays, some of them probably are, but back then they weren't, and so we were very glad that NSF didn't restrict us from applying because we were looking in an area that was maybe not a focus of some other agencies. So I'm going to talk a little bit for all those of you who might be trying to figure out if you might be a good fit and if you wanted to learn more and take the next step into the program. Our program is a funding for research and development. That's what the NSF does. We pay for technical R&D. And so the most important thing to make sure before you move forward and try to apply to the program is to make sure that if you have a company, that significant R&D is what you need to do right now. Because there's a lot of companies that don't need to do R&D. It's not, frankly, something that if you don't have to do it, it's not something I'd recommend you do as a company if you can get away with it. It's expensive and takes a long time, and it requires, certain personnel. If you can build a successful business without doing R&D, I recommend you do that. That's a much easier way to build a business. Some businesses, you have to do R&D because your product is not going to work until you figure out how to make it work with that activity. And so if your business can't move forward until you research and develop a certain kind of prototype or a pilot or do studies to prove the efficacy of your product, that's the kind of company that we're looking to support. We're looking for companies with what we call a unique and defensible technical innovation. This is the kind of thing that is really going to not just be a little bit better, but be dramatically better than what else is in the market right now. Because what you're doing is you're coming at the product or the customer in a totally different way. The example I like to use from our portfolio back in the 1990s is a company called Intralaser, which developed laser eye surgery. And so the idea of fixing your eyesight rather than by using a scalpel, which is what they did up until that point, but by using a laser, by literally firing a laser into your eye, that is a unique approach to eye surgery, or it was a unique approach when it was decided. It was totally different way to do it with big advantages if it worked, but with a lot of risk. And that's a great example of the kind of technology we're looking for. The nice thing about these defensible technical innovations is that if you get them to work, your company typically has a really strong and durable competitive advantage that makes it so that other companies just can't touch you and they can't really be on the same level of you in the market. What we call it an unfair technical advantage because they just simply can't make the innovation that you did, and yours is much better than the status quo. We're looking for companies that really are trying to commercialize as the vision and the mission of the company itself, where everything the company does is in service of taking this product and getting it into the commercial market and building a commercial business model that works. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people who are at the frontier of research and development, they are doing great research, but maybe the goal is not necessarily to aggressively commercialize. They may be more interested in kind of doing the next research project than in actually going into market and selling the products, right? That's understandable. We're really trying to fund companies where the commercialization is number one priority and their R&D is serving the commercial goals of the company, not vice versa. And so hopefully that's something that you can kind of understand why we look for that. And the other thing we look for, especially recently, is, and I'll talk more about this later, is we want folks to start having done some homework about their market and their customer. Understanding that, when you have a new and unproven technology, you're not quite sure how it's going to work, and so you can't totally understand how your business will function. But in general, we find that by creating a hypothesis about what your product can do and what market that might serve and what problem it might solve, and going and talking to customers, and the process of customer discovery is everywhere now in the academic world through the iCore program, which I'll talk about. This customer discovery process is a standard best practice for startup companies, even before they start doing technical work. Because the biggest reason that our companies fail is that the R&D works, they build the product that they expected to build, and then it turned out that nobody in the market actually cared about that product. That is a really unfortunate way to have your company fail. And it is the most common thing that we've seen with our companies in the past, which led us to create the iCore program about a decade ago, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So if you're going to apply and you haven't started to think about understanding your customers, we recommend you thinking about iCore or some other customer discovery like activity to start to do that research, because that's an incredibly important barrier for companies if you haven't done that. So I have a bunch of companies. I like to give some examples of companies so you get a sense of the types of things that we fund. I thought because of the specific group here of a kind of agricultural focused program, I'm going to talk about two kind of ag tech focused companies that are interesting companies that we funded. So let me skip some of these. Number one is a company called Ecovative Design. These are two undergrads at RPI, Eben Beyer and Gavin McIntyre. They graduated in 2008, and in his hand, Gavin is holding a piece of material that is basically a new kind of packaging material that is the basis for the company that they built called Ecovative Design. So what these guys do is they basically they found a new kind of fungus, a new kind of organism basically that actually can grow a mushroom root-based composite material based on agricultural waste as a feedstock. And so if you can see this second picture I put up, these are lampshades where that material is basically the root structure of a fungus that grows with no extra energy. It grows based on consuming, agricultural waste like peanut shells or corn husks. And it grows a material that behaves a lot like styrofoam. But the material is obviously not based on petroleum, it's based on waste. And it's biodegradable, compostable. You throw it in the backyard and it composts, it degrades in the environment. And so this is a way to basically have the same performance as styrofoam, but to not have the environmental, or the kind of petroleum source issues of styrofoam. So Ecovative Design was a company we funded back when I got to NSF. We funded them when they just graduated, and they're two people in a very small office. And over the time, they kind of built the company. Several years ago, they got some of their first customers. Dell was among their first customer. If you've ordered a Dell computer, you probably have gotten this material. You may have gotten this material. And they've actually started to create manufacturing jobs by having plants around the country that actually create this based on locally sourced agricultural materials. So again, just a totally different approach to commodity material based on a new technology. With really strong economic and also environmental impacts. So Ecovative Design, really cool company. If you want to actually get a kit to grow your own materials, I think you can buy that on their website. So if you're interested in doing that sort of thing. The other company I wanted to highlight is a company called Blue River Technologies. So again, these are the two founders. This is them sitting on a tractor with one of their first prototypes. These are folks who met at Stanford about a decade ago, and they're robotics. Lee Redden especially is a roboticist. And so what Blue River was formed to do was to basically take computer vision and help it to make agricultural processes more precise and more efficient. And so this is one of their early stage prototypes. And this is, you can see attached to this tractor, there's these 15 little modules. And each of those modules has a camera and a processing unit and a little pesticide sprayer where the machine can actually take pictures of the crop. And based on understanding which crops you want to spray because you want to thin them out, and which crops you want to not spray because you want them to grow, basically target the right crops to basically maximize the yields of things like lettuce and other crops. So it's basically a kind of a computer vision AI technology to help make sure you're only putting pesticide exactly where you need it to go. So this company was funded right when they got started in 2012, and did a lot of iterations, got their product in the field, did an early version of iCore, and about 6 years later, when they were just finishing up their NSF Phase 2 award, they got bought by John Deere for a reasonable valuation. And this technology was acquired by Deere. This is how many of our companies succeed at the end of the day, how they kind of finish out their company. They get acquired by a bigger company, and then a few years later, John Deere will launch an entire new product line with this technology across lots of their legacy equipment. So there's a whole now AI division within John Deere that Lee and Jorge are actually leading to basically try to make their equipment better and make it smarter so that you can save on costs, save on pesticide, and make farming more efficient. So these are a couple examples in relatively recent history of the program. We have lots of other great companies that I can talk about as well. A couple of things I just want to highlight in case you're thinking about moving forward and you've heard horror stories. Maybe not all of those are addressed here, but I do think we try to be a little more flexible and forgiving than a lot of government programs. And so here's a few things we really try hard not to penalize you for, things you shouldn't worry about. Number one is there a topic that fits? I know that's a really important thing for lots of government agencies. The topic that we have is really what I talked about in terms of deep technology, risky, unproven technology startups. That's the topic. Everything else is not very relevant to us. Is my project of interest to NSF? A lot of agencies are looking for projects that meet their internal needs. At NSF, we don't have any internal needs. We're a funding agency. We don't do much else but make funding decisions. And so we're never going to buy your product or use your product. And so we try not to let that be a factor in our decisions. We don't try to stress out on budgets. We don't stress out on whether people are new to the program. We try to be very forgiving. We don't really ding anybody for any administrative errors if we can help it. And so at other agencies, about a third of the proposals can get kicked out of the process for administrative errors. And at NSF, our rate of kicking proposals out for some kind of compliance issue is about 1% to 2%. So we do try to make it so that it's forgiving. And finally, we try to find innovation wherever it lives, and a lot of times that's at universities, but many times there's people who have tremendous new ideas and tremendous technical expertise, but maybe they don't have that traditional academic background, and we're not wedded to that. And so one of my favorite projects I ever funded was a new kind of high temperature refractory metal furnace. And the guy who was the deepest expert in the world in these furnaces had just had an associate's degree, but he had been building furnaces his whole life. And so he had his shop, and he built the best furnaces in the world, in his shop in the middle of Maine, in the state of Maine. And, expertise comes from lots of places. And so we love to hear from different folks who have different backgrounds. Okay, I'm just going to give you a really quick heads up of the process because I want to talk about, for those of you who are interested in learning more, the next formal step. I do recommend, there's lots of information on our website if you want to learn more before taking any firm commitment. Our website is seedfunds.nsf.gov. That'll be on my last slide, but it's got lots of information and examples, and you can search our whole portfolio. But when you want to make the decision to potentially apply to the program, we've created a two-step process. And the first step is created to be very lightweight and very fast. And it's called the project pitch. The project pitch is something you can submit through our website, the seedfunds.nsf.gov, anytime. It's basically about 2 pages about what you think you might want to propose as a project to NSF. Just enough information for us to see if we think it might be a good fit or if we think there might be a fatal flaw where it's just not appropriate for our program. And typically we tell folks that when you submit that pitch, you'll hear back in about a month about whether we think it might be a good fit or why it's not a good fit. Either way, we'll give you feedback. And the nice thing about that is that decision is typically going to come from the program director who's actually going to make the decision on your proposal. And so you're hearing from the actual best person to know whether it's a good fit. And typically the average response time is actually closer to about 10 days right now. So pretty light lift and pretty fast, and it will give you a sense whether you might be totally off track, the project pitch. if you do get invited based on the project pitch, we think it might be worth a full proposal. You can submit the full proposal. We have typically a few windows per year to submit it. The next one is coming up in July, and I won't get it too much into the weeds, but it has has a lot of pieces to it. Nilesh, you can empathize with that as well as a recent awardee. The full proposal is something that does take several months to get a final decision on, so it's not a fast process, but it is something where there's copious amounts of information if you get to that stage, as well as like weekly Q&A sessions from our program directors to answer questions and all kinds of other resources to help you through that process. But I would recommend not worrying about that until such time as you submit a project pitch and get invited. Okay, I think I've mentioned all these things. It's a little bit faint here, but you can see at the top of the screen, this is actually the URL to go to submit the project pitch or to see the kind of content of the project pitch. So if you're interested, that's there. And then this is what's actually included in the project pitch. This is on our website, but in case it's helpful, there's like really 4 big questions we ask that you'll need to look up. But feel free to go to our website if you want to get more detail on specifically what the project pitch is about. I think, is that my last slide there? Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna shift gears a little bit here. I have 2 more slides. And again, I'm gonna talk about 2 other programs that are really kindred spirits at the NSF, in the sense that the goal is to try to help empower people to think about taking technology from the lab into the market. And the first one is called Partnerships for Innovation. This is really you can think about it like the SBIR program that I've talked about, but it's a little earlier in the process. It's actually typically an award that goes to a university faculty member as the PI, but it's really a research that is kind of aimed toward thinking about eventually translating the technology into the market, whether it be through a startup company, through a licensing to a larger company or something else. So again, like SBIR, it's got broad technology areas. It's an award for doing really translational research. $500,000, 2 to 3 years, so it gives you a little more time than SBIR gives you, and again, doesn't require that you kind of jump out and form the company yet. So some of you may be thinking about this, but may not be ready to go and jump into a company. That's a big step, and so PFI is a great program if you're thinking about putting your foot in the water a little bit. So nsf.gov/PFI is the website for that. And then finally, and I'll talk a little more, I referenced I-Corps earlier, but for those of you who are not familiar, I-Corps is also it's not only a kind of a sister program, it's actually a program that was created by an SBIR program director. So I-Corps really emerged from SBIR at NSF because of this issue I talked about, where a lot of our companies that we were funding through SBIR were failing because they didn't understand their market and their customer sufficiently. So I-Corps is basically a program NSF launched about a decade ago based on the private sector best practice of what's called customer discovery, which is basically the idea that before you build a new product, you should go out and try to build a hypothesis as to what problem that product will solve, and go talk to the customers who you think have that problem and figure out if you're right. And basically apply the scientific method to the question of what problem can I solve? So I-Corps is basically an experiential educational program where we take university-based teams through this process of what we call customer discovery. And it involves creating a hypothesis for a business model for a new potential product, and then validating that hypothesis. And the way you take your data in this scientific method is you talk to lots of customers. And so the National I-Corps program will typically take a team of 3 to 4 people over 7 weeks and train them and have them interview 100 potential customers for a new technology, and based on what they think might be used for that technology through a cohort-based method where there's national instructors that NSF has trained to work with these kind of teams. And the I-Corps program has been really, I think, kind of a phenomenon since it launched. Started NSF, it pretty quickly made its way to most other research agencies, and actually was mandated by Congress a few years ago because they thought it was so powerful. And so at this point in time, the program has gone through about 2,000 teams through academic institutions. About another 2,500 of our phase 1 awardees have gone through a version of the I-Corps called the Beat the Odds Bootcamp. And about 1,000 new startup companies have launched out of a direct result of the end of an I-Corps program when the business model was validated and there was enough evidence to think about starting a new company. So the I-Corps is built through kind of a series of hubs, which are collections of universities that work together to launch this program. And there's hubs in 39 states, including in Missouri. Lots of different universities participate. So if you go to nsf.gov/I-Corps, you can learn more about that. Or if you're interested, I can connect you directly to Ruth Schumann, who is the National Program Direct Lead for I-Corps, one of my colleagues, who can give you more information. It's a $50,000 award for the National I-Corps program, which is an NSF-funded award. There's also lots of regional I-Corps programs that are not directly funded or supported by NSF, but that follow the same kind of process and that feed the National I-Corps program. So the regional programs are typically a little less intense, a little shorter. And if you go through the regional program, you gain typically the ability to apply for the national program. And those regional programs are, again, all over the place, and we can connect you with regional programs if you're interested in learning more about that. That is all I have. I wanted to leave time for questions. I think looks like we have some time left, so I will stop there, and I'd love to hear if anyone has anything for me that I can talk more about.
Ben, thank you for giving a great presentation. It's very informative. Next is the Q&A session, and I see two questions posted from the audience. First question is, we recently submitted a SBIR grant to USDA that was triaged. The comments indicated that we were too early in the development of technology, and they were really looking for something that was on the cusp of commercialization. They seem to direct their funding to scale up and other aspects of commercialization. So the question is, at what point in the development of the business should we approach the NSF SBIR program for funding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question because it does underline the differences between different agencies. I mean, every agency has a lot of latitude to implement this program based on the agency vision. And so I suspect that same project would not have gotten the same response from NSF. We're typically not telling people they're too early. You know, it's possible to be too early in terms of your understanding of the market, but it's usually hard to be too early for us in terms of the technology readiness level. If you don't know what the technology is yet, if you have an idea of, you know, I'm going to figure out what the technology is, that's too early. But once you kind of know what the kind of core secret sauce is of your company, you're usually ready for NSF. So we would never tell somebody we're trying to fund people on the cusp of commercialization, because that's not we want a higher level of risk, right? Our goal is to fund companies that the private market won't fund. And the biggest gap in the private capital market is at the beginning, right? People don't want to pay for the early technical research. Investors don't want to pay for that. It takes too long. It's too risky. They don't understand the technology. So I think probably the same technology might be better suited for NSF. I don't know anything about the case, but that's a hunch I have. As one example of that phenomenon, you know, we have a lot of companies in the life sciences and the medical devices and diagnostics, therapeutics, that sort of thing. So all those companies can also apply to the NIH, to the National Institutes of Health. So we fund a lot of companies that NIH also funds, but we almost always fund them about 2 or 3 years earlier because we are looking for a earlier stage, less proven technology. So I'm not sure if the same thing is true of USDA. We don't have as much data on that, but my guess is that from what I've heard from this question, it might be something NSF would look at.
Good. The second question is, how do you distinguish which tech transfer projects should come to you versus going to NIH or other agency?
So I think I just touched on one of the big differences, which is that we're funding startup companies and other agencies are not. So to give you an example of the the difference between agencies. Our phase 1 projects, if you look at all the awards, the phase 1 awards we made last year, 92% of those awards represented the first ever award to that company, the first ever government award of any kind in any agency. Out of all the other agencies, the highest percentage of, of that same statistic where the company was getting its first award was 35%. So we had 92%, and everybody else was between 8% and 35%. So the big thing is, one of the big ways to decide whether you want to go to NSF is if you're early. The other way that I think we distinguish ourselves is that we have a higher commercialization bar than other agencies. If you have a really strong commercial case, really strong commercial focus, I think we're a better fit. If your commercial focus is not quite as strong and you want to have a little more time to not think about the market as much and to take a little more time, I think other agencies might be better. We're really looking for people to go quickly to market. We want people to really have momentum. It's because it takes so long, even if you're working really hard and trying your best, it takes so long to get this kind of technology to market that we want people to really move quickly if they can, because, the longer you wait, the more risk there is with new technology. So I think those are the two things that I would say could be potentially differentiate what's good for us versus what's good for other agencies. But the other thing that people can do is they can apply to multiple agencies. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. It does take more work, but you're not breaking any rules. You couldn't accept the same work funded. We couldn't fund the same work as another agency, and both agencies pay for the same thing. But you can apply for the same project to multiple agencies, and there's nothing wrong with that. So that's another option.
Good. The next question is, can you talk more about the supplemental funding in terms of criteria and process?
Okay. Oh, sorry, I think I just lost my VPN. Hopefully I'm back now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My VPN timed out after 12 hours. I guess I turned it on earlier today. The supplemental funding is typically for the phase 2 of our award. That's mostly where it is. The phase 2 is $1 million as the base award, but the supplemental funding can be significant. And so the average phase 2 project ends closer to about 1.4, 1.5 million. And there's a bunch of things we do for supplemental funding in terms of things we want to encourage you to do. And that includes bringing in certain kinds of people to work on your project, like the RAU program that many of you may be familiar with, which is a research experience for undergraduates or veterans or teachers. But the big funding, the supplemental funding that we do, is mostly focused on commercial traction, right? So companies that are really showing us that they're doing good work, trying to get themselves positioned commercially to start working with customers and partners, and are getting close to actually, creating commercial outcomes. We have a couple of supplements that are basically predicated on their commercial traction. So I can get into the details of it, but the supplemental funding, it's something that's always at the program director's discretion. It's a very flexible thing we can use to give a company more funding if we feel like it would be helpful. But they're mostly about commercialization, since that's our main goal. And specifically, the biggest supplement we have is called the Phase 2B, and that's actually directly about them raising funding or revenue. So starting to bring in money to the company that we will then match 2 to 1 by giving you additional funding. The supplemental funding is always typically for more R&D. So it's the same type of things you're doing with it, but it's more flexible, and it's more about directly about commercial things than anything else.
Good. Next question is, SBIR application was applying for research teams with a technological product, but not a proper startup yet.
So the research teams, I'm not sure if that's a specific program or something else, but certainly most other funding opportunities are typically not required to be a startup, right? So certainly you can't apply for SBIR unless you have a company. That's an eligibility requirement. If you've already formed a company, I think SBIR is always a good choice, because the biggest kind of hurdle in this process is just starting the company. Once you've decided to do that, I think that's the biggest barrier. So once you've made that decision, I think you should commit to it and apply. If you're not ready to do that, then I can see applying for more research funding. And it really depends on the program. I mean, in some cases, some of the basic research can still be going on while the company is already moving forward and maybe getting SBIR funding. But it depends a little bit on the nature of the research, right? A lot of the companies we fund are spin-outs of universities. Maybe I would say up to half of them are connected with universities directly, maybe even 2/3. So that's very common, and I would just have that discussion. The project pitch is something where if you get invited, I think having that discussion with the program director would be a great suggestion.
Is there more funding for SBIR or STTR? And which one would you recommend?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So you'll notice I didn't mention STTR, and it's not because I have a favorite program. It's because at the NSF, we basically have collapsed these programs into a single entity where there's almost no differentiation between the two, because we don't view there as needing to be any difference in the goals of the programs. I think it's easier to understand as an applicant if we don't make them very different. Otherwise, you have to remember two different stories, right? So the difference between the two is there's one requirement that is different, which is this is a congressional program, and it's mandated to be different in certain ways. And the only way that it has to be different because Congress said so is that while both programs are for small business, the STTR is required to be a partnership between the small business and a not-for-profit research institution. Many times a university, but not always. It could be a national lab or an FFRDC. And so the way that you could decide which one to apply for is to figure out if the work that you're doing lends itself best to having a university or a not-for-profit research institution partner with you and do a lot of the work, right? So it's typically a 30% or more of the budget that has to go to that research partner. So if that makes sense, if your project is best accomplished by giving a big chunk of money to a university, for example, then STTR is a good fit. SBIR projects can have university partners, but there's no requirement for it, and the dollar amount could be smaller. So my baseline takeaway for those of you here is don't worry about the distinction because there's not any advantage that neither of them is going to give you an advantage. They're reviewed in the same review panels, and if you're going to get funded as an SBIR, you're going to get funded as an STTR and vice versa. We have ways to basically set the levels the same, set the bar the same for the two programs. But if you really want to figure out which one fits right now, I would think about whether it makes sense to partner with a university in that way. And whatever works for the budget in terms of the requirements that are laid out for your budget is what you should choose.
Wonderful. If no more questions, we're going to wrap it up. Shibu, do you want to say a few words?
I see one more question, Mengshi.
One more? Oh, okay. I'll just pause it. Okay. I think having the fund is essential, but how to allocate the fund correctly and efficiently to form the right team is also very important. Such as convert prototype to product, finance, marketing, HR. Is there any resource the NSF provide to help guide the teams to move forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would first of all say that for all of these programs, for NSF, SBIR, I-Corps, PFI, all the program directors, so Ruth Schumann, who does I-Corps, Jesus Soriano, who does PFI, and all of our program directors in SBIR. Again, most of us have done startups, and so we have that experience, and we're willing to help provide guidance. We typically try to provide more once you're an awardee. There's so many companies out there, and we only have a small team, and so we can't do deep advice to every company. So we definitely provide that to folks who are in the funnel, and especially who get awards from us. That's probably actually the biggest part of our job here is actually working with awardees versus processing proposals. But as to your question about how to allocate funding, let me say a couple things. Number one is that Congress limits where SBIR funding can go to, and honestly, for most of NSF funding, you're not going to be able to pay for anything but research or technical work with the basic funding, plus indirect costs and things like that. So NSF is almost never going to pay for marketing or sales, right? That's not something we're a scientific research funding agency. We're not going to pay for those kind of non-technical tasks at your company. So you'll probably need to, even if you get funding from us, you'll probably need to get funding from somewhere else to do those other things. But the way I like to think about general startup thoughts about how to decide where to focus your time, because that's a really good question, is I'm a big fan of basically thinking about the startup as basically a collection of risks, right? Risks meaning reasons you might fail, right? And so one kind of risk is technical risk. Your product might not work, might not be good enough. There's market risk, your market, you may not be able to find the right customer. There's people risk, your people, you may not find the right people may leave. Financing risk, you may not be able to raise money, right? So there's all these risks with a startup. And the way I like to think about how to focus your time is to think about what are the near-term risks for your company. What are the next 3 to 6 or 12 months of things that might kill your company? And try to knock out the near-term risks and think about what's right in front of you. It's important to have a long-term vision, but a lot of what I think people do at startups is trying to make sure you tackle the risks in order of immediacy. That's how we also think about the SBIR program. We want to have folks propose projects to us where they're looking at the biggest existential risks to their technology and you're hitting them first, right? There's no point in attacking the low risk until you've attacked the high risk, because the high risk might kill you. And so might as well decide that first, and then, and so I'm a big fan of having people try to look at your company as a collection of risks and really focus on the risks that are the most existential. And anything that you can do later and you're not worried that's just gonna fail, do it later, if that makes sense.
One more question. Can graduate students be the PI on SBIR grant?
I was a graduate student PI in an SBIR grant. Yeah, so typically speaking, graduate students have I think it's technically in many cases a half-time commitment legally. That's not necessarily in alignment with us. So sometimes you have to take a leave or somehow change your status with the university. And obviously that's up to you and the university to work out. But assuming you can meet the requirement of our project, which is that if you're the PI, you have to be at least 51% employed by the company during the award, assuming you can do that. So I took a leave of absence from my graduate program to be a PI for my company. And then I came back and defended after my phase 1 project was over. If you're able to do that, then actually that's a very common path, right? We have lots of companies, and honestly, the by far the most common leaders of these companies, founders and CEOs of these companies, are recent graduates and recent postdocs. That's by far the most common CEO. And those people typically take the company all the way to the end of they take it all the way to success. So, the companies that I talked about today, Eben and Gavin at Ecovative Design were both undergraduates. They graduated and sort of formed the company. Lee Redden and I think Jorge was maybe a staff member at Stanford, and Lee Redden was a roboticist PhD student before he graduated. So I don't know if they were PIs as grad students, but certainly being a PI right after you graduate is like a very, very common thing, or as a postdoc, and Nilesh, you can obviously speak to that arrangement as well. So I would encourage folks who are at that, maybe about to graduate or just graduated, to not feel like you're not ready to do it. There's an old saying that there's 4 things that you're never ready to do. One is get married, have a child, buy a house, and start a company. And I wouldn't do them all 4 at the same time, although I've seen people do it, but I think you're never going to feel ready to start a company. You just have to go and do it. And I can tell you that sometimes right after you graduate is the best time, because you're never going to be as willing to take risks as you are then, I think, for most people. So I would encourage you to not feel like you're not going to be ready, and just go ahead and do it if you feel like you should do it.
Okay, if no more questions, Shibu, say a few words.
All right. Thanks, Mengshi. Well, the questions kept coming in. Thank you for answering each and every one of them. And that shows how interesting and informative your talk was. So thank you, Ben. We appreciate it very much. So thank you. Yeah. And thanks to all of our participants for today's seminar or webinar. Our next webinar will be on March 23rd, same time at 3:30. Dr. Kerry Jacobs, Associate Professor in the Division of Applied Social Sciences and the Director for GECL. That is our program called Graduate Institute for Cooperative Leadership. She will present from anecdote to evidence, a look into governance practices of agricultural cooperatives. So again, thanks everyone. See you next time. And again, thanks, Ben.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.
Ben.